All right, so here are the slides, and here's the first one that he presents here in his thesis about gatekeeping, which is not all tourists are bad and not all gatekeeping is good, right? Now, these statements work both ways, right? So this statement works as it is. It also works in the inverse, right? So it would work as not all tourists are bad and not all gatekeeping is good. And it would also equally work as not all tourists are good and not all gatekeeping is bad, right? The inverse
for sure.
Right. So this is a good thesis that starts out and then jumps into your definition of tourist here. So perhaps, Armchair, if you could maybe present this information, I'll ask a little bit of questions.
Sure. So thing that's common across pretty much all tourists, regardless of what intentions they walk in with, regardless of whether they're good or bad, is that both types of tourists initially enter a space just because their curiosity is piqued. They find something that they find there's something that they find to be engaging, interesting, whatever, and then they might not have close attachments to either the subject matter and or the people, or in most cases both. But they do have something that catches their attention. And the real separation between these two groups happens once they start engaging with the community and with the subject itself. So the thing is, with a good tourist, they will approach the subject matter with an open mind and no judgment. And the reason why that is really important is because when you do enter a new space, when you start interacting with new people, every community, every just group or culture or whatever will have its own idiosyncrasies in the way that it interacts with other people. They'll have things that have an appeal that is not immediately obvious or not quite common sense.
So the difference here is, right, so you've got the good tourist that can, that approaches it with an open mind and no judgment. And I think this is very true. I try to approach a lot of things with as little judgment as possible. It's very hard to get to zero, but as little as possible. And to discern and articulate, this is huge, right?
Yes.
To be able to say, this person good, this person bad, or this thing good, this thing bad, discern different aspects, what appeals to them, what doesn't appeal to you, what type of content you like, what type of content you don't like, if you don't like unhinged content, or if you love unhinged content, right? And then this last one, to be able to coexist with perspectives other than your own. A big one might be, you might be in a chat enjoying a VTuber, and maybe there's people in there that are of different political perspectives or, different, ideological commitments, right? And you're able to enjoy the thing with those other people, right?
Oh, for sure. Or even something... sorry.
No, go ahead.
Even something as simple as just like, for example, the reason why that last point the last 2 points, I think you rightly pointed out as being really important, is because even when you're just watching one creator, a VTuber, a creator, just like any other human being who is performing as a job description, there are going to be many aspects to what they do, what they say on stream, especially, and to their content that might not necessarily gel with one another on paper. So, like, let's say, for example, that you have a VTuber that does ASMR content while also doing the kind of like casual streams, like collabs, let's plays, etc., on the side as well. And let's say you're someone who is vehemently against ASMR, partially because you don't enjoy it, partially because you're uncomfortable with the parasocial aspect. You need to be able to coexist with other people who are there purely because they enjoy that kind of content as well.
Right.
And the moment you have that kind of, you can't reconcile yourself with that kind of friction, even within the same fan base for the same creator, that's when things tend to like kind of fall apart. So
yes, absolutely. And I see that even with channels where you have people who, for example, I'll cover different cases, and those cases may have focused on different things, right? So there might be somebody that was really interested in my coverage of Disney, for example, but really didn't care about Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp, or vice versa, right? Really cared about Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp, but doesn't care about one thing or the other. And they try to influence you. I'll receive messages from people saying, hey, I really like this thing you do, I don't like this topic you cover. And my general response is, of course, for my channel is, hey, look, I'm covering what's breaking, what I think is important, and what people are asking me to cover, a nexus of those things. but you'll find that some people will be okay with that and tolerant to that. Say, hey, I understand you're okay covering these things. And some people will demand that you change and that you only do the thing that they want, right?
Yep.
Because they do not want anything else but what they want. And that's the bad side, right?
Yes.
Now, about the bad side. So I do agree with you on the commonality of they're interested in the subject matter. I guess the difference to me here is why they're interested in the subject matter, because I could say that for a good tourist, you might be genuinely interested because, for example, if it's VTubing, you just like anime.
Yep.
As a bad tourist, your interest might stem from the fact that you maybe hate anime and you want to, you want to influence this thing to be less like anime, right? Or to be less Eastern and more Western, right? That might be your agenda, right? But that still is an interest, right? It still means you're interested, but the why is different.
Yeah. And to that point, I do think that you are right about the fact that an interest could be either positive or negative. Like you could be motivated to be interested in something because you love it or because you hate it. But I do also think that that same interest can apply to good and bad tourists alike. Because it's very possible that someone comes into anime with the mindset of, oh, I hate this. I hate how I see it everywhere. I saw it at my baseball game yesterday and it didn't match the vibe at all. And then they go and check it out. They actually sit down, watch it with an open mind. And then they go, okay, this is like actually pretty good. So I do think that while you are right about that, it's still like a commonality between good and bad rather than a difference, I suppose.
I actually, you know what? I will say to a certain extent, when I was asked about VTubers before I knew what they were, I was like, oh, I'm probably not going to like that because it's streamers, and streamers are probably they're probably being annoying, and I prefer to keep it purely to anime. Like I didn't even know about it. Like I just didn't. In my mind, I like negged it a little bit. But then as soon as I actually watched VTubers, I was like, oh yeah, no, this is absolutely amazing. So you're right. You might go into it with a little bit of a negativity, but if you approach that with an open up enough mind to just try it out and listen, and that's where you're open, right? I think you are willing to be converted over and become a very good tourist who does open up and is able to, be a discerning, helpful part of that community. Versus on the other side, by the way, the bad tourist being somebody who comes in with contempt and prejudice, right? So I see this a lot in many different communities, saying the fans are toxic, saying the fans are XYZ.
That's always a good one when it comes up. Just calling everyone in the space toxic with no sense of no specifics, no segregation between like good and bad behavior.
Single fan is toxic, right? You're all toxic, all of you, right? And then saying, look, we need to purge, which is the cannot exist. We need to purge everybody else out of the fandom, which if I look at a fandom, and this is one of the good comparisons you brought up later when we talk about perversion, but Disney, right?
Yes.
And I think about Disney Star Wars, and I think about, for example, who is watching The Acolyte right now. And other than the God bless them, the reviewing channels on YouTube that are forced to watch these things because they need to put out the this is so bad review. Other than those guys, it's really just the Raylos and a very small amount of that group they were kind of catering to. And they've kind of gotten it. The bad tourists have kind of won, right?
Yeah.
And they've kind of taken over and said, no, we own this now, and we've gotten rid of all these nasty people, right, that had these other perspectives. W for us. Of course, that's an L for the franchise. So now I feel like we need to get to the next slide here, which this is kind of one of there's so much going on here in this slide, guys. There's so much going on here, but this is one that I was very, very blown away. They're all good slides. But this one, you've managed to articulate the good and the bad here, but I want you to kind of walk us through what's going on in this particular model. Obviously, you can see generally it's a tug of war between between bad tourists and the old guard, right? But just walk us through what's going on here, Armchair.
Yeah. So the way that you can think about the way that a fandom or an activity or an interest or whatever is defined is that you can conceive of it as a constant tug of war between people looking to change it simply for the sake of changing it and people who have enjoyed it and try to keep it or maintain its status as of the present. So those are the old guard, right? You have purists, OGs, and converts. Now, purists are people who insist that the best form of something is its most basic iteration. So these are
Sure.
people like unicorns, for example, or people who believe that, like, for example, when it comes to VTubing, that everyone should either be Japanese or like just a fan of Japan, that they should be idol-like in the way that they operate, etc., etc. And these are people who are also prone to being unwelcoming to new people coming in.
Yes.
Then you have the OGs. So these are just people who've been around the longest. And after that, you have converts, who are basically good tourists that have come in and then integrated into the fan base.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
So converts that's very clear. Convert is a good tourist that is integrated into essentially the old guard faction.
Yes.
Right? Because you can stay permanently if you wanted to as a kind of spectator or good tourist who's just enjoying the thing without engaging in any sort of debate or any sort of support for either side of this ideological battle, really. That would be somebody who just likes and subscribes to the Oshi. They watch Gura, right? They maybe buy Gura merch, whatever, but they're not getting in there and saying, oh yeah, they should be collabing with the Dodgers or they shouldn't be, right? They're not getting in there on one side or another of the argument. They're just saying, hey, look, we're here enjoying our thing, right? And you could stay here forever if you wanted to.
And I'm actually really glad that you brought it up, because the main thing that defines that sort of transition from integrating from just being a good tourist into being a convert is your ability and willingness to articulate what it is you like about the thing you enjoy. Mm-hmm. And articulation is the main force that both sides are using to pull the rope in either direction. Sure. So this is a tug of war where the first side to run out of proper means of articulating their thoughts and feelings loses. As Ellen pointed out, like in the middle, you have good tourists and spectators. This is the side that, as a byproduct of this struggle, both bad tourists and the old guard are kind of fighting over. And the reason why good tourists and spectators are so important is because a good tourist can kind of, in addition to just sitting aside and watching this whole thing go on, a good tourist can also integrate into either side. And you never want to lose a good tourist to just being turned off to your fan base simply because, actually the way that I put it originally was, when instead of dedicating yourself to articulating what it is you enjoy about your particular area of interest or hobby or whatever, mm-hmm. that is the equivalent of taking one of your hands off of the rope, digging into your pocket for a gun and trying to shoot the other side. Sure, you might hit, you might miss, but regardless of what happens, you've reduced your ability to pull. And as a result of that, on top of that, good tourists might be put off if your default way of defending your fan base, your community, is just generalized vitriol and personal attacks.
Do you think that goes both ways though? Because obviously, a lot of times, bad tourists are pulling out the gun and shooting, saying, "You guys, the old guard, you guys are the ists and the phobes and the et cetera," right? And of course the old guard shoots back and says, "No, you guys are the ones that are." Ideologically XYZ, right? But that has nothing to do with whether Space Marines should be female or whether male and female VTubers should collaborate, right? Or whether VTubers should just speak Japanese, right? Yeah, that has nothing to do with one thing or the other thing.
And if both sides are if both sides devolve into that kind of shit slinging, that's when good tourists and spectators as a whole tend to get turned off from the entire fan base, and that's a loss. Away. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a loss because you lose people who have no idea of what they're missing out on and who otherwise might have been integrated and become a core part of your fan base. So on the other side, you have the bad tourists. These are people who are segregated into three main groups: perverts, activists, and inquisitors. Now, Yeah, so when I say perverts, I mean perverts in the most literal definition of the word. People who seek to corrupt the nature of a thing. So, for example, the the largest perpetrators of perversion in any fandom are not people. They're not like, the fetish artists that are only interested in making Rule 34 of whatever
Mhm,
the main draw of the community is.
mhm,
It's corporations who seek
mhm,
to pervert the nature of the thing by just turning it into a mode to gain profit and nothing
mhm.
else. So
Right.
when I talk about perverts, that's what and who I'm referring to. Because
And
like, yeah, fetish artists
I
are
do
part
want,
of that group, but they're not all of it. Yeah.
and I'm going to put a pin in the comment about corporate in general, like for the, because there's a point I want to make there, but not right now, because you bring up that a couple times. But I do agree with you though that they often are the ones that want to change it for a commercial purpose. And because not only for a commercial purpose, but because they have so many external strings, any given corporation has so many things pulling on them, including, as is famous now and everybody knows, stuff like DEI or Bridge, etc. Right? They've got all these things pushing them, including economic interests, personal interests, right? So in the case of like Niji Sanji, we just talked about like Riku having a substantial share of stock, right? That is a way that is perverted away, because now when he's looking at this lens, he's looking at, how do I personally make money? How do I enrich myself? How do I buy another car, another yacht, another racehorse, right? So you've
Yeah.
got all these other strings that are attached to it, which have nothing to do with the original, nature or interest itself, right? They're aside from that, right? Um,
Actually, in that
yeah.
point, to touch on what baked turkeys brought up before, another red flag when it comes to just like the idea that bad tourists are winning in a space. And this doesn't have to be like an industry or franchise wide thing. This can even just be in the scope of a single company, for example. A really big red flag is when the way that that content is made, when the way that a company operates, especially in like a talent centered industry like VTubing, when the shareholder meetings start to become the focal point of just the way that they operate in general, that's a really big red flag, because that means that, again, the people that the content centers around, the creators, the VTubers themselves, have become sort of secondary in focus to just the goal of making money. And
Right.
that's when things can really start to slip. So,
And look, I want, okay, I'll bring up now, I guess, which is like, look, I do genuinely believe that in many cases, having a business around something, having even a corporation, it has the potential to be good, right? It can allow something to reach a broader audience. For example, just because if I'm an indie VTuber, right, I don't have the economy of scale of a corporation. I don't have somebody that's doing my marketing, that's doing my advertising, that's helping me with my model, that's helping me with rigging, that's helping me with branding, right? With helping with my channel, my social media. So the amount, if you just look at it too in terms of numbers, right? The ability of a corporate VTuber to get to hundreds of thousands, if not, eventually millions of subscribers, right, is obviously due to both support, network effect, etc. So there are positive things that a corporation can do. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that these corporations also have these other interests, which very easily pervert it. I guess what I'm trying to say is, when I was listening to your thing, I was saying, okay, yeah, I agree with you, but not all corporations necessarily end up being evil, right?
yeah.
Um,
Um,
Now they might start out, by the way, you might start out not evil and then become evil. I think of the famous Google motto,
yeah.
right? Don't be evil, which they actually removed as their motto.
Yes.
Um, which
Uh,
should concern everybody. But yeah. You could start one way and end up another. But I do agree with you as a general thesis, right? As a general thesis, yes, I do agree. Corporations have the number one incentive, reason, and historically, you bring up Disney. That is probably the best point, right? Of
yeah.
somebody that wanted to exploit it for money and agenda purposes, and has completely failed that. But they definitely perverted it from what it once was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I mean, since you bring up Disney, like if you look at Star Wars in general, when I talk about the nature of a thing, right? So, for example, um, when I talk about the interest and its nature, you can just sum that up in one word if you want to put it really crudely, and that is just brand identity. And the thing
Mm-hmm.
is, talking about the brand identity of a franchise, especially of like, for example, Star Wars, a story. When you think about like original Star Wars, that was a story that had multiple different like important and central themes. It's stuff like, you know, the inherent corruptibility of mankind, the temptation of easy power, heroism, the idea that like no matter how far gone someone looks, deep down there is a core of decency that could flip a switch at any moment and open up the road to redemption. All of those are ideas that have been completely corrupted and lost in this new iteration of the Star Wars franchise. Because again, it's not a franchise that's designed to satisfy those kinds of like those elements that make a story a story. It's just it really does just look like a bunch of checkboxes being ticked off to like send some sort of message.
So I'll let you explain this. So you want to talk, I think this one is about defense against bad actors.
Yep. So generally what tends to happen, and this is a trend that's been going on and increasing in popularity over the last, like, let's say around like 10, 15 years, especially, where bad actors will enter a space and their default defense against criticism is holding up their own personal traits and attributes and sort of using that as a shield. So this can be stuff like, their sexuality, their gender identity, their degree of qualification, their race, their allegiance to a larger social cause, or just general movement. And again, the thing is, when they hold those things up as a shield, when they use that as a justification for whatever they've made, however poor in quality it might be, a lot of people may make the mistake of being Pavloved into associating that thing that they're holding up as a shield with the reason why they are behaving the way that they are. So the way that I put it is, never make the mistake of launching a personal attack against a bad actor against like the things that they end up holding up to distract you. Never.
Right, so don't you're saying don't attack them based on the shield.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So again, if they're talking about like, okay, I'm only thinking and expressing myself this way because I was taught to do so in media school as a journalist or whatever, don't make the mistake of thinking, okay, well, that's the only thing I can criticize then, because again, that shield is used to protect a bunch of other like things that you actually can criticize. Things like the fact that they have claims to moral superiority, that they're condescending when they interact with people who've been in the space for longer. The idea that they are like paternalistic in the way that they want to interact with the fan base. So paternalism meaning to restrict someone of their freedoms under the pretext that it's good for them. Then you have things like corporate cynicism, the idea that they're only interacting with something because they believe it can make money, or they only see something as a money-making tool. And then on the other side, you have the deficiencies that they're often trying to hide. Things like an absence of creativity or originality, prejudice against, the hobby itself or the people who enjoy it, a lack of technical skill. Maybe they really are just garbage writers who cannot string together a plot to save their lives. Willful ignorance of nuance. So again, the idea that they aren't aware of like the various different perspectives or nuances to someone's enjoyment of a thing or a fandom's way of interacting with one another, so they just go in, pretend they don't see anything, pretend they don't need to see anything, and just make judgments and calls regardless. So
yeah, that's actually very, very that's all very, very true, and I guess I do agree with you. You should never attack them on that. One thing I will say though, my initial comment here was, I believe, and I've commented on this before, I think they use that shield as at least a sword, or maybe you could say they give it a shield bash, like I do say like that shield it's defensive. Certainly it's defensive. But I do feel like many times, particularly with the and let me go back here, with the bad tourist crowd, right? That's used as a way to attack. Right. So saying, okay, we are this, you are not this, therefore you are disqualified from your contribution. Right. You don't share our, you didn't get a degree in this. Right. Credentialism. Right. You don't belong to this identity group, whatever that identity group is. Right. You don't belong to this or this political group. Right. You're not a member of BLM, and not the base legal mindset, which you guys can join. And, we're going to have a BLM level in members only stream very soon, very, very soon. But we're talking about other BLMs, and so therefore you can't comment on this, right? Your opinion is invalid, right? It is difficult not to mention it when it's used both defensively and offensively is what my comment would be. It's very difficult. I do agree with you that you shouldn't, but I do think it is very difficult.
I would agree because I do very much see how these same traits, even though I did like in the metaphor, like phrase it as a shield, I can see how it's often used to like bludgeon people into accepting bad work. So generally, the way that I would say generally what tends to happen, and this is specifically when it comes to journalism that I'll be referring to. What will often happen is a publication will put out a bait article, or they will phrase something in a way that is designed to bait people into attacking one of the traits that are like held up on the shield, right? So again, they'll nudge you with it, they'll bludgeon you with it, but they're hoping that when you do retaliate, you will hit the shield and not the things behind it. So I do very much agree that it can be very difficult to ignore those things, but even though it might sound like a suboptimal solution, perhaps the best way of dealing with that kind of behavior, that kind of bad faith advocacy, would just be to point out that that that's what they're doing, to call out that they're doing that. For example, if someone is trying to say, look, you don't have a degree in journalism, therefore you have no right to critique my review of this game, you can point out, okay, that's, again, your credentials are fine, but your takes are still bad, and then point out the reason why those takes are bad, for example. Especially when it comes to like, this is something that we've seen from game journalism in particular, where articles will often be written with the idea in mind that there will be people coming after them because they are a game journalist. You can actually see that start to work its way into the material that articles are actually beginning to incorporate, even just in the writing room. So I think there was an article that was recently released, I think 27th of June, where it was basically we should go back to trusting game reviewers again. And that was an article with an entire basis in just video game reviewers, game journalists are being persecuted by this horrible fan base, glossing over all of the reasons why that fan base might have been put off by the work that they've been putting out for years, and then trying to hold up their credentials and, even in a broader sense, the abuse that they have endured from more, let's say, unhinged members of their potential audience, as a shield from criticism to the fact that they have for years now been trying to insert political agendas in the most ham-fisted way possible into the material they report about, that they have a willful ignorance of the nuance behind why people may be uncomfortable with the idea of political or social commentary, as obvious and ham-fisted as that, in their games, things like being just generally prejudiced against their potential audience, and on top of just being really condescending in general when they come up with whatever they put out. So
yeah, and that is something that you can attack. So you could be like, hey, this guy's a condescending fucking prick, right? That's open, right? That's open for attack, right? You can attack the actual. So maybe you can't attack the education. This is one that you kind of hear, but you can attack a claim to moral superiority, right? Or the foundation of that, saying, well, the underlying point with education would be like, better about the specific thing. Well, okay, well, let's attack the fact that that's maybe paternalistic, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe or even, that lacks technical skill, right? So yes, you went to journalism school, but if you attack the writing itself, saying, look, your writing itself is deficient, right? That undermines your that does undermine that, right? Because obviously if you're holding that up as credentialism and you can't even spell correctly, right? That's a problem.